Due to the nature of this content, listener discretion is advised. The following story contains descriptions of violence, torture, and death. Hello, listeners. Thank you for joining us on a terrifying journey as we travel back to 1833 Philadelphia to get a glimpse of Eastern State Penitentiary in its prime. We hope you enjoy our telling of the history of Eastern State, as well as our description of the grounds today.
John was a businessman, or at least that's what he called himself. Everyone else would call him a con man. So what if he tricked some people for a little bit of their money? He called that survival. The funny thing was, he wasn't even in here for that. He was actually in here for illegally concealing a small firearm. John considered himself quite smart. Smarter than the average Joe. It's how he survived this long. So a year or two here wouldn't be that bad. John knew what living on the street was like. Hard, cold, and not knowing where your next meal was going to come from. So a couple of years in the Eastern State Penitentiary wouldn't be that bad. There was plumbing and heat, two luxuries that even Andrew Jackson didn't have in the White House. There were also rumors that a local gunslinger was serving time for the same crime. That was sure enough to get him some street cred. The cell was large enough to only take a couple of steps. There was a skylight that let the morning sun peep through to provide a reminder of the everlasting presence of God, or something. John wasn't much for religion. He felt like he was going insane. Besides the skylight, there was only a cot, toilet, and a desk that held one thing, a Bible. It was easy to lose track of time here. Had it been a couple of months or days? There was no way of knowing. John closed his eyes, trying to remember what the outside world looked like. He kicked himself for taking it all for granted. John swore to himself that once he got out, that he would go on the straight and narrow, or at least not get caught next time. The silence was deafening. There was nothing but the low hum of the electric light. He hadn't had any human contact since he had been here. Every once in a while, John thought he heard the shackles of a new inmate, but every time he called out, the guard submitted him to torture. He needed to talk to someone, but he swore that the guards were on some random schedules. What made it worse was that he could never hear them coming, so it came to a surprise when they caught him trying to talk to the man in the cell right beside him. "You can't do this to me!" John screamed as they dragged him back to solitary confinement. "You need to be taught a lesson for your insubordination," the warden told him. They put a flour bag over his face to prevent him from seeing anything. They can't do this, John thought. He struggled to get free from the firm hands that were collapsed around his arms and shoulders. They dragged John to the end of the hall and threw him on the ground. They then proceeded to chain his arms up as tight as possible. John thought his hands were going to be torn off from the pressure. The flour bag was ripped from his head, and he screamed as loud as possible, "You can't do this to me! Help! Someone help me!" But it was no use. No one was coming. He felt his vocal cords already hurting after days or weeks or maybe months without using them. When he was done, the guards forced his mouth open and put something metallic in. The sharp iron cut into his cheek and tongue with every fruitless move he made. This was the device that every inmate feared, the iron gag. He heard about this device from the other prisoners, or at least the ones that came back. But this socializing was the exact reason he had it over his mouth now. It was hard to determine the difference between the taste of blood and iron after a while. But the worst part came after. John noticed he couldn't cough or swallow. His heart started racing a mile a minute. Any move he made to get the blood out of his throat just let more in. There was no way to get rid of it. Was this how he was going to die? Choking on his own blood? John started to cry at the thought. John always thought he would die from the bottle, but this was too much for him to handle. He was supposed to be in here for 50 months, just a little over 2 years, not life. He could feel his breath start to get weaker as he started pleading for God to do something, anything, to get him out of here. But God would not answer him here.
Adopting the Quaker philosophy that people should be punished and rehabilitated through isolation and silence in the presence of God, solitary confinement was born and implemented in the U.S. for the first time in 1829 Philadelphia. Eastern State Penitentiary was an architectural marvel designed to enforce this form of discipline. The $800,000 fortress, containing central heat and air, running water, and toilets while the president was still using an outhouse, was also home to some barbaric methods of punishment. Complete silence was protocol at Eastern State. Guards even wore covers over their shoes to muffle their steps. When an inmate stepped out of line, they were tortured using various methods, including the iron gag, leading to one inmate's death in 1833. However, the solitary confinement policy was rather short-lived. By the 1850s, Eastern State housed more inmates than they were equipped for and began shoving several people into single cells before eventually closing in 1970. Housing Slick Willie, Morris Bobler, and Al Capone, Eastern State brings ghost hunters and tourists to Philadelphia every year and is one of the more interesting museums that I have ever been to. So what did you think about Eastern State?
There's a lot of cool stuff that I didn't know was in there, like the stripped car that we saw.
Oh yeah, that was really cool. I didn't realize it was a car at first because it was kind of smashed down, and
it was kind of dark in there too. There were a lot of cells that you could look into, but you kind of had to use a flashlight.
Yeah, and then Al Capone's cell was pretty cool.
Yeah, he had a lot of different or more luxuries than most other inmates there.
So yeah, and I was looking into that, and I was wondering why there were 2 cots in his room. He actually had a roommate.
Really?
Yeah, he had a roommate, and then the vintage-looking rug that's on the floor, they made.
Why'd they make it?
Because they weren't able to, buy it. It was a rug they made in prison.
One room that was dedicated to all the stuff that the inmates collected. And also, it had the mummified cat in there.
Mm-hmm. So I was reading, and that was from when they shut down Eastern State, and there were apparently a bunch of cats that started living in the ruins. So they took all the little vintage items and the butterflies and stuff that the inmates were collecting, and they put a cat mummy in there with it.
Also, I think my favorite part was about the dog Pep that was sentenced to life for murdering a cat.
Did you know he was given a personal cell and an inmate number, and he entered the prison ledger, and underneath the alias section it said a dog?
That's funny. But all of that wasn't true. The real reason he was in there was to lift inmate spirits.
They didn't put the dog in prison for killing a cat?
No.
Oh.
A lot of dogs would have been put in prison if that was the case.
Your dog would have been put in prison.
My dog would have.
So yeah, it was funny because it was 1924 when they put the Pep in the prison, and it was just so overcrowded. They felt like they needed to lift the inmates' spirits with an animal, put another thing into the overcrowded prison for the inmates to pass around.
He spent 2 years there until he was transferred to a farm branch,
which I think was another prison about 35 miles north of Philadelphia. I think there was more room for him there. So one of the things I really like that Eastern State does from a museum perspective is its effort to address mass incarceration.
Yeah, they really don't hold back. They talk about race and incarceration over time, gang affiliation and incarceration over time. This is all shown on this big 3D graph in the middle of the courtyard.
And then there's exhibits where you walk into old cells and there's projections of inmates talking about incarceration on the walls, and then there's some notes from inmates on the walls, and then they have an interactive exhibit which touches upon a lot of incarceration factors.
They have this thing where you put down a bunch of stuff from your life that it'll ask you about, and it'll tell you the likelihood of if you'll be incarcerated or not.
Yeah, it talks about how affluent the area you live in is, and whether you grew up in poverty, whether you had both active mother and father figures, and whether either of them were in prison. And it's really interesting, and I think it does a really good job.
So, would you recommend this place to other people?
I absolutely would recommend it. What about you?
Yeah, there's so much stuff we also didn't touch upon here. Something you really have to see for yourself if you can.
Yeah, there's a lot more to do.
Oh, I almost forgot that at least when we went, the thing was they give you this little audio track, and those at each point they'll have like play tape number 1, 2, 3, and ours was voiced by Steve Buscemi, so that was fun.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you guys liked this video.
And if you did like it, make sure to give it a like. Also, comment what you guys thought. We'd always want to hear more about discussing these places that we've been, and if you've been there.
And if there's anything that we missed, anything you'd like us to talk about, or any places that you want to see us go next.
Because we might be revisiting some of these places. We've got a lot more lined up.
Yeah, I definitely think we'll probably revisit St. Mary's. Yeah, check out our other videos if you haven't.
And remember to subscribe.
Thanks, guys.